I never imagined that refusing to hand over my portable heater would lead to a middle-aged woman spending an entire winter night shivering in her sedan. But that's exactly what happened when Deborah Kingston decided to flex her HOA president powers one frigid January evening in Boulder, Colorado. The whole mess started on a Tuesday afternoon when I got home from my shift at the tech startup downtown. I'm Nathan Irving, 32 years old, and I'd been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for about 8 months. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looked vaguely similar, painted in approved shades of beige, gray, or cream. When I bought the place, I knew there was an HOA, but the realtor assured me they were reasonable. That should have been my first red flag. I pulled into my driveway at around 5:30, the January sun already dipping below the mountains, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees, and the weather forecast predicted it would hit single digits by midnight. I grabbed my laptop bag from the passenger seat and headed inside, looking forward to cranking up the heat and making some dinner. My house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage. The previous owners had apparently skimped on the HVAC system because the furnace had been acting up since November. I'd had 3 different repair guys come out, and they all said the same thing. The system was ancient and barely functional. A full replacement would cost around $8,000, money I didn't exactly have lying around after putting down the mortgage and dealing with all the closing costs. So, I'd been supplementing with space heaters, particularly a really nice ceramic tower heater I'd bought for my home office. I was halfway through microwaving some leftover pasta when my doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I could see a figure standing on my porch, bundled up in what looked like an expensive down coat. I opened the door to find Deborah Kingston, HOA president and neighborhood busybody extraordinaire. Deborah was probably in her late 40s, with that aggressively highlighted blonde hair that seemed mandatory for women in positions of minor suburban authority. She wore designer glasses and had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I'd met her twice before. Once at the closing when she'd welcomed me to the neighborhood by handing me a 40-page HOA rulebook, and once when she'd knocked on my door to inform me that my trash cans were visible from the street 3 hours past the designated pickup time. "Nathan, good evening," she said, her breath creating little clouds in the freezing air. "I need to speak with you about an urgent matter." I stepped aside to let her in, mostly because I didn't want to heat the entire outdoors. "What's going on?" She stomped her boots on my welcome mat with more force than necessary and walked into my living room without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes immediately scanned the space, and I could practically see her mental checklist going. Furniture placement, wall decorations, cleanliness level. I wondered if she was about to cite me for something. "I'll get straight to the point," Deborah said, unwinding her scarf. "The community center's heating system has failed, completely broken down. We have an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for tonight at 7 o'clock, and it's absolutely freezing in there. I've been calling around to all the residents, and I need to collect portable heaters to make the space usable." I blinked at her. "Okay, that's unfortunate. But what does that have to do with me?" "I'm collecting heaters from homeowners," she repeated as if I were slow. "I need yours, however many you have. This is for the good of the community." Something about her tone immediately rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. "I have a couple of space heaters that I'm actually using. My furnace is barely working." Deborah waved her hand dismissively. "It's only for one night. The meeting will last 2 hours at most. You can survive without heat for a few hours. I, on the other hand, need to conduct official HOA business, and I cannot do that if the board members are freezing. I'm sorry, but no, I said, keeping my voice level. Like I said, my heating system isn't working properly. I need the heaters I have. Her expression shifted from mildly annoyed to openly hostile in about half a second. Excuse me. This is a community matter, Nathan. When you bought your home here, you agreed to support community initiatives. I agreed to follow reasonable HOA rules, I countered. I didn't agree to give up my personal property whenever you demanded it. Why don't you just reschedule the meeting for when the heating system is fixed? Absolutely not. We have urgent business to discuss tonight. The meeting cannot be postponed. She crossed her arms. I'm going to ask you one more time. Please provide your space heaters for the community center. And I'm going to tell you one more time. No, they're my heaters. I'm using them and you have no right to take them. Deborah's face flushed red. I am the HOA president, and I have every right to expect cooperation from residents. This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that undermines community cohesion. Then I guess I'm selfish, I said, moving toward the door to show her out. I'm not giving you my heaters. You'll have to figure something else out. She didn't move. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. I'm making a note of this. Your lack of community spirit will be reflected in your resident file. We'll be discussing this at the meeting tonight. Great, you do that. In the warm car you're going to drive home in while I sit here trying to keep my pipes from freezing. I opened the front door. Have a good evening, Deborah. She stormed out, her boots clicking sharply on the porch steps. I watched her march across my lawn, taking the direct route to her car instead of using the walkway, probably as some kind of petty power move. Her silver Lexus sedan was parked directly in front of my house, and she climbed in, slammed the door, and sat there. Just sat there, engine off, staring at my house. I closed my door and went back to my reheated pasta, figuring she'd leave in a minute or two once she finished whatever angry text messages she was firing off to the HOA board. I ate my dinner, caught up on some emails, and around 6:30 I glanced out my front window. The Lexus was still there. Deborah was still sitting in the driver's seat and the sun had fully set now. The temperature was dropping fast. By 7 o'clock, I was genuinely confused. The car hadn't moved. I could see Deborah's silhouette in the driver's seat, occasionally illuminated by what I assumed was her phone screen. I pulled on my jacket and went outside, walking up to her car. She rolled down the window about 2 inches when I approached. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I am documenting your refusal to assist the HOA," she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I'm sitting here in the cold, just like all the board members will be sitting in the cold community center tonight, all because you refuse to help. That's insane. Just go to the community center if you need to have your meeting. I told you it's uninhabitable without heat. I'm making a point. By freezing in your car in my driveway," I stared at her. "Deborah, this is ridiculous. Go home. Turn on your heat. Have a normal evening." "Not until you agree to provide the heaters for tonight's meeting." I laughed because I genuinely thought she was joking. "You're going to sit in your car all night because I won't give you my heaters. If that's what it takes to demonstrate your selfishness to the entire community, yes. This is crazy. I'm going back inside. Do whatever you want." I turned and walked back to my house, expecting her to give up this stupid protest within the hour. It was going to be 9 degrees tonight. Nobody was that stubborn. By 8 o'clock she was still there. I could see her in the car, wrapped in what looked like a blanket she must have had in her trunk. Her windows were starting to fog up from her breath. I called my buddy Marcus, who lived 2 subdivisions over, and told him what was happening. "Let me get this straight. Marcus said, barely containing his laughter. The HOA president is sitting in her car in your driveway in 9-degree weather because you won't give her your space heaters. That's exactly what's happening. Man, that's commitment to being petty. What are you going to do? Nothing. She can't stay out there all night. She'll give up. But 9 o'clock came and went. Then 10. I kept checking and the Lexus remained in the same spot. Around 10:30 I saw another car pull up, a Honda CR-V. A woman got out and approached Deborah's car. They talked for about 5 minutes, the other woman gesturing animatedly, probably trying to convince Deborah to leave. Eventually, the woman got back in her Honda and drove away. Deborah stayed. At 11, I started to actually worry. The temperature was now 7 degrees according to my weather app. This had gone from absurd to potentially dangerous. I put on my heavy winter coat and went back outside. Deborah's window was frozen shut, so she had to open the door a crack to talk to me. Deborah, this has gone on long enough. You need to go home. You're going to get hypothermia. Then give me the heaters. Her voice was shaking now, whether from cold or anger or both, I couldn't tell. No, this is insane. You're sitting in a freezing car over space heaters. Just go home. I will not be bullied by residents who refuse to support the community. I'm not bullying you. You're the one staging some kind of freeze-out protest in my driveway. I didn't ask you to do this. Your refusal forced me to take this action. I wanted to shake her. My refusal to hand over my personal property forced you to sit in a freezing car. Do you hear yourself? That's not how cause and effect works. I will stay here until you cooperate. Then I guess you're staying all night because I'm not changing my mind. I went back inside, frustrated and angry. This woman was actually going to give herself frostbite over a power trip. I tried to go to bed around midnight but couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check the window. The Lexus was still there, a dark shape in the streetlight's glow. I could see occasional movement inside. At one point, I saw her running the engine, probably to get a few minutes of heat, but then it shut off again. She must have been worried about carbon monoxide or running out of gas. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee. This was officially the most bizarre situation I'd ever been in. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and trying to figure out if I had any legal liability if this lunatic actually hurt herself while sitting in my driveway. I hadn't invited her. I hadn't forced her to stay. I'd explicitly told her to leave multiple times, but would that matter if she ended up in the hospital? I pulled out my phone and started Googling. After about an hour of research, I determined that I probably wasn't legally responsible for her choices, but I screenshotted everything I could find just in case. I also started documenting the situation, writing down times and what had been said. If Deborah wanted to play stupid games, I'd be prepared for the stupid prizes. At 4:30 in the morning, another car pulled up. This time it was a silver pickup truck, and a man in his 50s got out. He spent about 10 minutes talking to Deborah through her car window, and I could tell he was getting frustrated. He threw his hands up at one point, got back in his truck, and drove away. Deborah remained. The sun started to rise around 7. I'd been awake all night, alternating between anger and disbelief. The temperature had bottomed out at 5 degrees around 5 in the morning and was now slowly climbing back up to a balmy 12 degrees. I showered, got dressed for work, and prepared to leave for the day. I had a 9 o'clock meeting downtown that I couldn't miss. I went outside to my car, which was parked in the garage. Deborah's Lexus was still in front of my house, and when I backed out of my driveway, I could see her in the driver's seat, looking absolutely miserable. Her face was pale, her lips had a bluish tint, and she was shaking violently. The blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, and she looked like she hadn't slept at all. Against my better judgment, I stopped my car and walked over to her window. She rolled it down a couple of inches, moving slowly like her joints were frozen. "Deborah, you look terrible. You need to go to a hospital and get checked out. You've been out here for over 12 hours in single-digit temperatures. Give me the heaters." Her voice was hoarse and weak. "No. Go to a doctor. This is over. It's over when you cooperate." I threw my hands up. "Fine, freeze. I'm going to work. If you're still here when I get back, I'm calling the police for trespassing." I drove away, watching her in my rearview mirror. She didn't move. This woman had officially lost her mind. Work was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My coworker Sarah noticed and asked if everything was okay. I told her the whole story and she looked at me like I was making it up. Wait, she stayed in her car all night, in 5-degree weather, all night. I'm not kidding. That's legitimately psychotic. You need to call the cops. And tell them what? A woman is voluntarily sitting in her car on a public street. They can't do anything about that. She's harassing you. Technically, she's harassing herself. Sarah shook her head. HOAs are a cult, I swear. My parents had one that tried to find them because their rosebush was the wrong shade of pink. I left work early, around 3 in the afternoon. I had to know if Deborah was still there. Part of me hoped she'd finally given up and gone home. Part of me was genuinely worried she might be dead. When I turned onto my street, my stomach dropped. The Lexus was still there. But now there were 2 other cars parked nearby, a police cruiser and an ambulance. I parked in my driveway and jumped out. A police officer was standing near Deborah's car, talking to a paramedic. Deborah was sitting in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in thermal blankets, looking stubborn despite her obvious physical distress. The officer, whose name tag read Martinez, turned to me as I approached. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes, I'm Nathan Irving. What's going on?" We received multiple calls about a woman sitting in a vehicle in apparent distress. The paramedics are evaluating her now. "Do you know this woman?" Her name is Deborah Kingston. She's the HOA president for this subdivision. She's been sitting out here since about 5:30 yesterday evening. Officer Martinez's eyebrows shot up. "Since yesterday evening? Why?" I explained the whole ridiculous story, the demand for my heaters, my refusal, her decision to stage a protest in my driveway. The officer listened with an expression that cycled between disbelief and exasperation. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said when I finished. "Miss Kingston demanded you give her your personal property. You refused. So she decided to sit in her car in your driveway overnight, in single-digit temperatures, as some kind of protest." That's exactly what happened. I told her multiple times to leave. I have no idea why she's still here. The officer walked over to the ambulance and spoke with Deborah. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I caught snippets. Deborah was insisting she had every right to park on the public street. She claimed she was documenting my refusal to support the community. She said this was a matter of principle. The paramedic, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, interrupted. "Madam, you're showing signs of moderate hypothermia. Your core temperature is 93 degrees. You need to come to the hospital." "I'm fine. I just need him to do the right thing." Deborah pointed at me. "Madam, you are not fine. You spent the night in 5-degree weather. You could have died." Officer Martinez looked at me, then back at Deborah. "Miss Kingston, Mr. Irving has no legal obligation to provide you with his personal property. You've been parked on a public street, which is technically legal, but what you're doing constitutes harassment. If you don't accept transport to the hospital and then go home, I'm going to cite you for disorderly conduct and possibly harassment." "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association," Deborah said, as if that explained everything. "I have authority here." You have no authority to demand someone's personal property, and you have no authority to harass residents, Martinez said firmly. Those are your options, hospital and home, or I start writing tickets and possibly make an arrest. Deborah looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. This isn't over. The board will hear about your complete lack of community cooperation. There will be consequences. Looking forward to it, I said, too tired to care anymore. The paramedics convinced Deborah to go to the hospital for evaluation. They loaded her into the ambulance, still wrapped in thermal blankets, still glaring at me like I was the villain in this story. The ambulance drove away, lights off since it wasn't technically an emergency anymore. Officer Martinez stayed behind to take my statement. I walked him through everything again, giving him exact times and details. He took notes and shook his head periodically. I've been doing this job for 15 years, he said, and I've seen some weird HOA disputes, but this might take the cake. My advice: document everything. If she continues to harass you, file for a restraining order. And honestly, you might want to consider reporting this to the rest of the HOA board. This woman doesn't sound stable. Trust me, I plan to. Martinez handed me his card. Call if she comes back or if you have any more trouble, and save any messages or emails she sends you. You might need them. After he left, I went inside and collapsed on my couch. I was exhausted from not sleeping, my head hurt, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. A grown woman, a person in a position of neighborhood authority, had literally spent the night freezing in her car because I wouldn't give her my space heaters. It was beyond irrational. It was unhinged. I heated up some soup and tried to decompress. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking for an update. I gave him the short version, and he responded with a string of laughing emojis followed by "That's absolutely bonkers, man. Watch your back." I spent the evening researching the HOA bylaws and my rights as a homeowner. The rulebook Deborah had given me when I moved in was dense and boring, but I forced myself to read through it. Nowhere did it say anything about residents being required to hand over personal property for community use. There were rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, holiday decoration timelines, and 1,000 other petty regulations, but nothing that supported what Deborah had tried to do. I also found the contact information for the other board members. Besides Deborah as president, there was a vice president named Tom Richter, a secretary named Linda Wallace, and a treasurer named Paul Chen. I drafted an email to all three of them, explaining what had happened and expressing my concern about Deborah's behavior. I kept it factual and professional, attached photos I'd taken of her car in my driveway with timestamps, and sent it off around 9 that evening. The responses came quickly. Linda wrote back within 20 minutes. "Nathan, I'm absolutely appalled to hear about this situation. This is completely unacceptable behavior, and I assure you the board will address it. I'm so sorry you had to deal with this." Tom's response came an hour later. I heard Deborah ended up in the hospital. She called me from there, actually, and told a very different version of events. But based on what you're describing and the photos you've provided, I think we need to have a serious board discussion about her conduct. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Paul didn't respond until the next morning, but his message was equally supportive. This is exactly the kind of overreach that gives HOAs a bad reputation. I'm calling for an emergency board meeting to discuss Deborah's actions. You'll be invited to attend and present your account. I felt a little better knowing that the other board members seemed reasonable and weren't going to automatically side with Deborah just because she was president. I went to bed that night actually managing to sleep, exhausted from the previous night's drama. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up to find my truck's windshield covered in sticky notes. I walked outside in my pajamas and bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, and stared in disbelief. There had to be 50 bright pink sticky notes plastered all over my windshield, each one with a handwritten message. Selfish. Bad neighbor. Community destroyer. Think of others. Shame. I pulled out my phone and took pictures from multiple angles, then started peeling off the notes. They were stuck on there pretty well, and the adhesive left residue on my windshield. I was going to have to really scrub to get it all off. As I was collecting the notes, my neighbor from across the street, an older man named Ralph who mostly kept to himself, walked over with his own coffee mug. "What the heck happened?" he asked, looking at the pile of sticky notes in my hand. I gave him the abbreviated version of the story. Ralph listened, his eyes getting wider, and then he started laughing. "Deborah did that. Deborah Kingston sat in her car all night in your driveway because you wouldn't give her your heaters. That's what happened. That woman has always been wound too tight, but this is next-level crazy." He shook his head. "She came around yesterday asking me for heaters too. I told her I didn't have any, which was a lie. I have 3 in my garage, but something about the way she demanded it rubbed me wrong. Glad I lied now. Did you see who put these sticky notes on my truck?" "No, but it had to be early this morning. I came out to get my newspaper around 6:30 and they weren't there yet." "When did you notice them?" "Just now, around 7:15. Ralph frowned. "Deborah's got a couple of friends in the neighborhood who are just as bad as she is. Patricia Monroe and Susan Fletcher. They're like her little flying monkeys. I'd bet money one of them did this." I thanked Ralph for the information and went back inside to shower and get ready for work. I was running late now because of the sticky note cleanup, and I was furious. This was absolutely harassment, and it was probably going to escalate. At work, I got an email from Tom Richter with the subject line: "Emergency HOA Board meeting Saturday 2 p.m. The message explained that the board was convening to discuss recent events involving board president conduct and community member disputes. I was invited to attend and present my account of what happened. The meeting would be held at Tom's house, since the community center's heat was still broken. I confirmed my attendance and tried to focus on work. My boss had noticed I'd been distracted and pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay. I gave her a very brief overview, and she looked sympathetic. "HOA drama is the worst," she said. "My sister dealt with something similar where the HOA president tried to fine her for having the wrong color mailbox. It turned into a whole legal thing. Do you need any time off to deal with this?" "No, I should be fine. There's a board meeting on Saturday where hopefully this will get resolved." Friday was relatively quiet, which made me nervous. No sticky notes, no messages, no cars parked in my driveway. I kept expecting something to happen, but nothing did. I spent the evening preparing notes for the Saturday meeting, printing out all the documentation I had. Photos of Deborah's car in my driveway with timestamps. The text messages Marcus had sent me that could verify timing. Screenshots of the weather showing how cold it had been. And Officer Martinez's business card with the incident number he'd given me. Saturday arrived cold but sunny, with temperatures in the low 20s. I dressed in business casual clothes, grabbed my folder of documentation, and drove to Tom Richter's house. He lived about 6 blocks away, in a newer section of the subdivision where the houses were slightly larger. Tom answered the door and greeted me warmly. He was a tall guy in his early 60s with gray hair and a friendly face. "Nathan, thanks for coming. Come on in. The others are already here." I followed him into a spacious living room where Linda Wallace and Paul Chen were sitting on a sectional sofa. Linda was a woman in her 50s with short red hair and a kind smile. Paul was probably in his 40s, Asian American, with glasses and a laptop open in front of him. "Nathan, good to see you," Linda said, standing to shake my hand. "Though I wish it were under better circumstances." Paul nodded in greeting. "Thanks for putting together such detailed documentation in your email. It made this a lot easier to take seriously." "Where's Deborah?" I asked, looking around. "She was invited, but she declined to attend," Tom said, sitting down in an armchair. "She sent an email this morning saying she doesn't recognize the authority of this meeting and that we're all conspiring against her." Linda rolled her eyes. "She's been getting worse over the past year. The power has really gone to her head." We spent the next hour going through everything. I presented my timeline, showed the photos, and explained exactly what had happened from my perspective. Tom revealed that Deborah had called him from the hospital and told him that I had lured her to my house and then trapped her there in the cold. She'd claimed I was the aggressor and that she was the victim. "That's completely insane," I said. "I have a witness who saw her sitting there voluntarily. My neighbor Ralph was outside and saw the whole thing. Officer Martinez's report will back up my version." Paul pulled up something on his laptop. "I got a copy of the police report yesterday. Officer Martinez was very clear in his notes. He writes, and I quote, 'Miss Kingston voluntarily remained in her vehicle despite multiple requests from Mr. Irving to leave. She appeared to be staging a protest related to a dispute over personal property. Mr. Irving showed no signs of aggression or wrongdoing. Miss Kingston's behavior was erratic and potentially dangerous to her own health.'" Linda shook her head. "This is grounds for removal from the board. This is harassment, abuse of authority, and frankly, it makes the entire HOA look bad. If word gets out that our president did something this bizarre, it's going to hurt property values." "I agree," Tom said. "I move that we remove Deborah Kingston from her position as HOA president, effective immediately, due to abuse of authority and harassment of a community member." "Seconded," Paul said. Linda nodded. "All in favor." All three of them raised their hands. It was unanimous. "Nathan," Tom said, turning to me, "I want to formally apologize on behalf of the board for what you went through. This should never have happened. Deborah had no right to demand your property, and her subsequent behavior was completely unacceptable. We're removing her from the board, and we'll be sending a letter to all residents explaining the situation in general terms, without naming you specifically if you prefer." "I appreciate that," I said. "But what about the sticky notes on my truck? And what's to stop her from harassing me further now that she's been removed?" Linda leaned forward. "Did you keep the sticky notes?" "Yes, I have all of them." "Good. That's evidence. If she continues to harass you, you'll have grounds for a restraining order. We'll also be sending Deborah a cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further harassment of residents will result in legal action from the HOA itself." Paul added, "We're also going to review all of her actions over the past year as president. There have been other complaints, though nothing as extreme as this. If we find other examples of abuse of authority, we may pursue further action." The meeting wrapped up around 4 in the afternoon. I left feeling cautiously optimistic. Deborah had been removed from power, the board seemed reasonable, and there was a plan in place to protect me from further harassment. But I also knew that people like Deborah didn't take these kinds of losses well. She'd been publicly humiliated, removed from a position she clearly loved, and in her mind, I was the one responsible. I didn't have to wait long to be proven right. That evening, around 8 o'clock, my doorbell started ringing. Not just once or twice, but continuously, someone just leaning on the button. I looked through the peephole and saw Deborah standing on my porch, her finger pressed firmly on the doorbell. I pulled out my phone and started recording before opening the door, making sure to keep the chain lock engaged so she couldn't push her way in. "Deborah, stop ringing my doorbell. You got me fired," she screamed. Her face was red, her eyes wild. "You ruined everything. I've been president for 3 years, and you destroyed it all because you're selfish. I didn't get you fired. You got yourself removed by harassing me and sitting in your car all night like a lunatic. Now get off my property before I call the police. I'm on the sidewalk. This is public property. You can't tell me what to do." She wasn't actually on the sidewalk. She was on my porch, but she clearly wasn't thinking straight. "Deborah, I'm warning you. Leave now or I'm calling 911. Call them. Tell them how you refuse to help the community. Tell them how you're destroying this neighborhood with your selfishness." I closed the door and immediately called the police. I kept recording through my front window as Deborah continued to ring the doorbell and pound on the door. She was screaming about the HOA, about community values, about how I was a terrible person. It was honestly disturbing to watch someone have such a complete meltdown. The police arrived within 10 minutes. This time it was a different officer, a woman named Officer Jenkins. She approached Deborah, who was still on my porch, and I could see them talking through the window. Deborah was gesturing wildly, pointing at my house, clearly agitated. Officer Jenkins remained calm, speaking to her in a level tone. After about 5 minutes, the officer came to my door and asked if she could come in to talk. I let her in and showed her the video I'd recorded on my phone. I also explained the entire history with Deborah, including the previous incident with Officer Martinez. Officer Jenkins watched the video, took notes, and nodded. "Mr. Irving, I'm going to strongly recommend that you file for a restraining order on Monday morning. This woman is clearly escalating. She's been told to stay away from you, but here she is again, harassing you on your property. A restraining order will give you legal protection and make it easier for us to arrest her if she continues. What happens now? I'm issuing her a citation for disorderly conduct and trespassing. She's being warned that if she comes back here, she'll be arrested." But honestly, people in her mental state don't always listen to warnings. That's why you need the restraining order. Officer Jenkins went back outside and spent another 10 minutes with Deborah. I saw her handing Deborah what looked like a ticket. Deborah was crying now, her earlier rage transformed into self-pity. She got into her Lexus and drove away, tires squealing slightly as she accelerated down the street. Officer Jenkins came back to give me the incident report number and her contact information. "Call us if she comes back. Don't engage with her at all. Just call 911 immediately." After she left, I sat down and tried to process what was happening. This had spiraled so far beyond the original dispute over space heaters. Deborah had completely unraveled, and I was apparently the focus of all her rage and frustration. I texted Tom Richter to let him know what had just happened, and he responded immediately. "This is terrible. I'm consulting with the HOA's lawyer on Monday about our options. Please take care of yourself and get that restraining order." Sunday was quiet, thankfully. I spent most of the day indoors, catching up on household chores and trying to relax. I kept the curtains closed and my phone nearby, half expecting Deborah to show up again. But she didn't. Monday morning, I took the day off work and went to the Boulder County Courthouse to file for a restraining order. The process was more complicated than I expected, involving multiple forms and a brief meeting with a judge to explain why I needed the order. I brought all my documentation: the photos, the police reports, the video from Saturday night, the sticky notes. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, reviewed everything carefully. "Mr. Irving, based on what you've shown me, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order effective immediately. Miss Kingston is prohibited from coming within 100 yards of your home, your workplace, or your person. She's prohibited from contacting you in any way, including phone, email, text, or social media. There will be a hearing in 2 weeks where she can contest the order if she wishes, but until then, this is legally enforceable. If she violates it, she'll be arrested. I felt a wave of relief. Finally, some real protection. The court would serve Deborah with the restraining order within the next 24 hours, and I'd have a copy for my records. I went to work after the courthouse visit and tried to get back into my normal routine. My boss was understanding about the time off, and my coworkers had heard bits and pieces of the story. A couple of them shared their own HOA horror stories, which made me feel a little less alone in this bizarre situation. Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Tom Richter. "Nathan, I wanted to let you know that the HOA hired an attorney, and we're reviewing all of Deborah's actions from her time as president. We've found some concerning things. It looks like she may have been misusing HOA funds for personal expenses. There are credit card charges that don't match up with any legitimate community expenses." "Like what?" "Dinners at expensive restaurants that she claimed were board meetings, but none of us were at those dinners. Purchases from high-end clothing stores that she labeled as professional attire for community representation. It's not a huge amount of money, maybe $3,000 or $4,000 over the past year, but it's still misuse of community funds. We're considering filing a police report." "You should," I said. "She needs to face consequences for all of this." "I agree. I'll keep you updated." The next 2 weeks passed without major incident. Deborah apparently received the restraining order and for once seemed to be following the rules. I didn't see her, didn't hear from her, and didn't find any more sticky notes on my truck. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe the worst was over. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. I showed up at the courthouse with all my documentation, not sure if Deborah would even appear. She did, accompanied by a lawyer, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The hearing took place in a small courtroom with just the judge, me, Deborah, her lawyer, and a court reporter. The judge asked me to present my case for why the restraining order should be made permanent. I walked through everything again: the initial demand for my heaters, her overnight vigil in my driveway, the sticky notes, the doorbell incident. I showed the photos, the videos, the police reports. Deborah's lawyer tried to argue that the situation had been a misunderstanding, and that his client was under extreme stress due to her HOA responsibilities. He claimed she'd simply been trying to serve the community, and that I'd been uncooperative. The judge was not impressed. "Counselor, your client sat in her car in 5-degree weather for over 12 hours because Mr. Irving refused to give her his personal property. That's not stress, that's harassment. Then she showed up at his home days later after being warned by police and created another disturbance. That's escalation. I'm making the restraining order permanent. Miss Kingston is to have no contact with Mr. Irving for a period of 2 years. If she violates this order, she will be arrested and charged accordingly." Deborah started crying, her face crumpling. "This isn't fair," she said to her lawyer. "I was just trying to do my job." "Your job didn't include harassing residents," the judge said firmly. "This hearing is concluded." I left the courthouse feeling vindicated but also exhausted. This whole ordeal had consumed weeks of my life and countless hours of stress and worry. I just wanted it to be over. A week later, Tom Richter called me again. "Nathan, I wanted to update you. the HOA board voted to file criminal charges against Deborah for misuse of funds. We submitted all the documentation to the Boulder Police Department, and they're opening an investigation. It looks like she stole about $4,500 from the HOA over the past 18 months. Wow, I knew you said it was a few thousand, but that's more than I expected. Yeah, once we really dug into the records, we found more and more questionable charges. She was using the HOA credit card like it was her personal account. The police detective we spoke with said this is more common than people think with HOAs and small community organizations. People in positions of minor authority sometimes convince themselves they're entitled to perks. What happens now? The investigation will take a few weeks. If they find sufficient evidence, which I'm confident they will, she'll be charged with theft and embezzlement. It's a felony because the amount exceeds $500. I thanked Tom for keeping me informed and hung up. Part of me felt bad for Deborah. Her life was falling apart. Removed from the HOA board, restraining order, potential felony charges. But then I remembered her face when she was screaming at me, her complete lack of remorse, her absolute conviction that she was right and I was wrong. She'd brought all of this on herself through her own actions. Another month passed. Spring was starting to arrive in Colorado, the temperatures climbing back above freezing, the snow melting, everything turning green again. I'd almost managed to put the whole Deborah situation out of my mind when Tom called me one more time. "Nathan, I thought you'd want to know. Deborah Kingston was arrested yesterday. She's been charged with felony theft and embezzlement of HOA funds. The district attorney is prosecuting the case." I sat down on my couch, processing this news. What's going to happen to her? Her lawyer is apparently trying to negotiate a plea deal. She'd probably get probation, restitution, and community service if she pleads guilty. If she goes to trial and loses, she could face actual jail time, though that's less likely for a first offense, but she'll have a felony record either way. And the restraining order is still in effect. Yes, for another year and a half, she's not allowed anywhere near you. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about the whole absurd chain of events. It had all started with such a simple thing, a request for space heaters. If Deborah had just accepted my refusal gracefully, none of this would have happened. She'd still be HOA president. She wouldn't be facing criminal charges. Her life wouldn't be in ruins. But she'd chosen to escalate at every opportunity, to double down on her position, to refuse to admit she was wrong. I thought about calling Marcus to update him, but he'd been following the whole saga. Instead, I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. It was a beautiful evening, the sun setting behind the mountains, the air fresh and clean. As I walked past houses with their perfect lawns and approved paint colors, I realized how much I'd learned about the dark side of suburban community living. HOA, in theory, were supposed to maintain property values and create pleasant neighborhoods. But they also gave small-minded people power over their neighbors, and that power could corrupt even seemingly normal individuals. Deborah Kingston probably started out with good intentions, wanting to serve her community and keep the neighborhood nice. But somewhere along the way, the power had become intoxicating. She'd started to believe she was entitled to deference, to obedience, to whatever she wanted from the people who lived here. I walked past Deborah's house, which was about 8 blocks from mine. The lights were off, and there was a "for sale" sign in the front yard. Tom had mentioned she was probably going to have to sell to pay restitution and legal fees. Another life consequence of her choices. When I got home, I found a letter in my mailbox from the HOA board. It was signed by Tom, Linda, and Paul, and it was addressed to all residents. Dear Meadowbrook Heights homeowners, we are writing to inform you of recent changes to the HOA board leadership. Deborah Kingston has been removed as board president due to violations of community standards and misuse of authority. Tom Richter has assumed the role of president, and we are in the process of electing a new board member to fill the vacancy. Additionally, we want to remind all residents that HOA rules and requests must be reasonable and lawful. No board member has the authority to demand personal property from residents or to harass residents who decline voluntary requests. We are committed to serving this community with respect, integrity, and fairness. If you have concerns about board conduct, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want Meadowbrook Heights to be a place where everyone feels comfortable and respected. It was a good letter, acknowledging the problem without airing too much dirty laundry. I appreciated that they were trying to move forward positively. Over the next few months, life returned to normal. I got my furnace fully replaced in April, finally solving my heating issues properly. The new system cost $7,500, but it was worth it to not have to rely on space heaters anymore. The neighborhood settled into its usual rhythms: people mowing lawns, kids playing in the streets, neighbors chatting at the mailboxes. I ran into Linda Wallace at the grocery store one day in May, and she gave me an update I hadn't been expecting. Deborah took a plea deal, she said, loading groceries into her cart. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft. She got 2 years probation, has to pay back everything she stole plus fines and court costs, and she has to do 200 hours of community service. No jail time. No, the prosecutor said that wasn't necessary for a first offense, especially since she's paying restitution. But she has a felony record now, which will follow her forever, and she moved out of the neighborhood last month. I think the shame was too much for her. I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. I never wanted to ruin her life. I just wanted her to leave me alone. Linda put her hand on my arm. You didn't ruin her life, Nathan. She did that all by herself. You just stood up for your rights, which is what anyone should do when someone in authority abuses their power. She was right, of course. I'd done nothing wrong. I'd simply refused an unreasonable demand and defended myself against harassment. The fact that Deborah had spiraled so dramatically wasn't my fault. That summer, the neighborhood had a block party, something the HOA sponsored every June. I almost didn't go, still feeling a little gun-shy about community events after everything that had happened. But Marcus convinced me to stop by, and I'm glad he did. It was actually pleasant. People were friendly, the food was good, and several neighbors came up to me to express their support. Ralph, my neighbor from across the street, pulled me aside at one point. I heard about everything that happened with Deborah. Just wanted to say I think you handled it exactly right. That woman needed to be stopped. She'd been getting more and more controlling for years, and somebody had to stand up to her. A younger couple I hadn't met before, Jason and Emily, introduced themselves. We moved in 3 months ago, Emily said, right after all the drama. We heard the stories, and honestly, if Deborah was still in charge, we probably wouldn't have bought here. The new board seems so much more reasonable. It was validating to hear that people understood what had happened and didn't blame me for it. I'd been worried that some residents might see me as the troublemaker, the guy who'd caused problems in the neighborhood. But the opposite seemed to be true. People were grateful that Deborah's behavior had been exposed and that the board had taken action. As the evening wound down and the sun set behind the mountains, I stood in the street with a plate of potato salad and a beer, watching kids chase each other around while adults laughed and chatted. This was what community was supposed to be. People living near each other, being friendly, helping when asked but respecting boundaries. Not demands and power trips and freezing in cars overnight to prove a point. I thought about that night, the absurdity of Deborah sitting in her Lexus for over 12 hours in single-digit temperatures, all because I wouldn't give her my space heaters. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Her removal from the board, the discovery of her financial misconduct, the criminal charges, the restraining order, her eventual conviction and departure from the neighborhood. All because she couldn't accept a simple no. The whole experience had taught me valuable lessons about standing firm when you're right, about not caving to unreasonable demands just to avoid conflict, about the importance of documentation when dealing with unstable people. It had also taught me that positions of authority, even minor ones in a suburban HOA, could reveal a person's true character. Some people rose to the occasion and served their communities honorably. Others, like Deborah, let the power consume them until they couldn't tell right from wrong anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's the block party? Any crazy HOA ladies demanding your lawn furniture?" I laughed and typed back. "All quiet on the Western Front. New board is normal. It's almost boring." Boring is good, my friend. Boring is very good. He was right. After months of chaos and stress and police reports and court hearings, boring was exactly what I needed. I finished my beer, said goodbye to a few neighbors, and walked home as the streetlights flickered on. My house looked peaceful in the evening light, the lawn neatly trimmed, the exterior paint in the approved shade of gray, everything conforming to the HOA standards that were actually reasonable. I went inside, cranked up the air conditioning now that summer had arrived, and settled onto my couch with my laptop to catch up on some work emails. Life had returned to normal, but I'd never take that normalcy for granted again. I'd learned that even in the most mundane suburban setting, with its manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses, human drama could explode in unexpected ways. I'd learned that standing up for yourself was important, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it caused conflict. And I'd learned that some battles, however ridiculous they might seem, were worth fighting. The whole saga of Deborah Kingston and her overnight vigil in my driveway would probably become a legendary story in Meadowbrook Heights, passed down to new residents as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I could imagine future homeowners asking, "Is this the neighborhood where the HOA president froze in her car because someone wouldn't give her their heater?" And the answer would be yes. Yes, it was. But it would also be the neighborhood where the board did the right thing, where residents supported each other, where justice eventually prevailed. Deborah had faced consequences for her actions: loss of position, criminal conviction, financial restitution, and the permanent stain of a felony record. It wasn't about revenge or schadenfreude. It was about accountability. People in positions of authority, no matter how small that authority might be, needed to be held accountable when they abused it. As I got ready for bed that night, I checked my locks out of habit, a remnant of the anxiety from when Deborah had been actively harassing me. The house was secure, the restraining order was still in effect, and Deborah was gone from the neighborhood. I was safe. I thought about the space heaters that had started this whole mess. They were in my garage now, stored away for next winter. Simple ceramic tower heaters, nothing special, probably worth $100 each at most. The fact that such an ordinary object had become the focal point of such extraordinary drama was almost funny in retrospect. Almost. The months continued to pass. Fall arrived, then winter again. The 1-year anniversary of the incident, as people in the neighborhood had started calling it, came and went. My furnace worked perfectly, so I didn't need the space heaters at all. I thought about donating them but decided to keep them, just in case. They'd become oddly symbolic, totems of a battle I'd won simply by refusing to surrender what was mine. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Deborah had moved to Denver and was working as a receptionist at a dental office, one of the few jobs she could get with a felony record. Her probation would end in another year, but the conviction would stay on her record forever. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her, despite everything. She'd made terrible choices, but she was still a human being dealing with the consequences. Tom Richter proved to be an excellent HOA president. He was reasonable, fair, and actually listened to residents' concerns. The board approved several positive changes: a community garden, improved playground equipment at the park, better lighting on the walking trails. The neighborhood felt friendlier, more cohesive, less like a place where everyone was watching everyone else for violations. I ran into Officer Martinez one day at a coffee shop downtown. He recognized me immediately. "Hey, you're the heater guy. How's everything going?" I laughed at being remembered as the heater guy, but filled him in on how things had resolved. Deborah's removal from the board, the criminal charges, her conviction and departure from the neighborhood. Martinez shook his head admiringly. "You did everything right. You documented, you stayed calm, you didn't engage when she tried to provoke you. That's exactly how you're supposed to handle that kind of situation. A lot of people would have either given in to avoid conflict or escalated it themselves. You found the middle path." "I just didn't want to give up my heaters," I said with a shrug. "And you shouldn't have had to. That's the whole point. She had no right to demand them, and you had every right to refuse. The fact that she couldn't accept that says everything about her character and nothing about yours." We chatted for a few more minutes about other things, then went our separate ways. But his words stuck with me. I'd found the middle path, not giving in to unreasonable demands but also not seeking unnecessary conflict, standing firm while remaining calm. It was a good lesson for life in general, not just for dealing with overzealous HOA presidents. The restraining order finally expired in late spring, 2 years after it had been issued. I got a notification from the court, and I realized I'd barely thought about Deborah in months. She'd become a story I told at parties, a crazy experience I'd survived, rather than an active threat in my life. The expiration of the restraining order didn't worry me because I knew she was gone, moved on with her life, hopefully learning from her mistakes. On a warm Saturday in June, 3 years after the whole saga began, I was working in my front yard, planting some flowers that were within the HOA's approved species list. A car slowed down in front of my house, and I looked up, expecting to see a neighbor. Instead, I saw Deborah's silver Lexus. My heart rate spiked for a moment, old anxiety flooding back. But the car didn't stop. Deborah was in the driver's seat, and she looked older, tired, her hair no longer that aggressive highlighted blonde but a more natural gray-brown. She glanced at my house as she drove past, and our eyes met for just a second. There was no anger in her expression, no hatred, just a kind of weary sadness. Then she accelerated and continued down the street, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a moment, trowel in hand, processing what had just happened. She'd been in the neighborhood, driving past her old house maybe, and had gone past mine in the process. She hadn't stopped, hadn't gotten out, hadn't violated the expired restraining order in any way. She just looked and then moved on. I went back to planting my flowers, and I realized that the encounter didn't bother me the way I'd once thought it might. Deborah Kingston was no longer a threat, no longer a source of stress. She was just a person who'd made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. I could see her as human again, flawed and broken but human nonetheless. That evening, I sat on my back deck with a beer, looking out at the mountains in the distance. My house was comfortable, my furnace worked perfectly, my neighbors were friendly, and the HOA was reasonable. Life was good. The drama of those winter months 3 years ago felt like a distant memory, something that had happened to someone else, but it hadn't happened to someone else. It had happened to me, and I'd handled it, and I'd come out the other side okay. Better than okay, actually. I'd learned about my own strength, my ability to stand firm in the face of absurdity, my capacity to navigate conflict without losing my cool. Those were valuable lessons, even if they'd come through such a bizarre and stressful experience. The story of the HOA president who spent the night freezing in her car because I wouldn't give her my heaters would probably follow me for years. New neighbors would hear about it. Coworkers would ask me to retell it at happy hours. Friends of friends would say, "Oh, you're that guy." And I'd learned to be okay with that. It was a good story after all. A weird, frustrating, ultimately vindicating story about standing up for yourself and refusing to cave to unreasonable demands. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, I went inside my warm, comfortable house. I passed by the garage where those space heaters were still stored, unused for years now. I thought about donating them one more time, but again decided to keep them. They weren't just heaters anymore. They were a reminder of what could happen when minor authority went unchecked, when people prioritized power over reason, when someone decided their demands were more important than another person's rights. But they were also a reminder of the good things that had come from the situation. A better HOA board, a more cohesive neighborhood, stronger community standards against harassment and abuse. Deborah's downfall had, in a strange way, improved life for everyone in Meadowbrook Heights. It had shown people that standing up to bullies was possible, that documentation and proper channels could work, that justice could prevail even in minor suburban disputes. I settled onto my couch with my laptop and saw an email from Tom Richter. The subject line read, "3 years strong." I opened it to find a message to all board members and active community volunteers, thanking everyone for their continued efforts to make Meadowbrook Heights a great place to live. He included some statistics. Property values had increased, resident satisfaction surveys showed high marks, and participation in community events was up significantly. "We've come a long way from the challenges of 3 years ago," he wrote, "and we should all be proud of the community we've built together." I smiled and closed my laptop. We had come a long way. From that cold January night when Deborah Kingston sat in her car in my driveway, refusing to accept no for an answer, to now, when the neighborhood thrived under reasonable leadership and mutual respect. It was proof that even small acts of resistance mattered, that standing up for what was right could have ripple effects far beyond the immediate situation. The heaters stayed in the garage, forgotten by everyone except me. And that was exactly how it should be. They'd served their purpose, not by heating anyone's space, but by becoming the unlikely catalyst for positive change in a suburban neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado. Sometimes the most important battles are fought over the most mundane objects, and sometimes refusing to surrender something as simple as a space heater can change everything. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, comfortable in my warm house, secure in my peaceful neighborhood, grateful for the lessons learned and the strength discovered during those strange winter months 3 years ago. Life had moved on, and so had I. But I'd never forget the night Deborah Kingston chose to freeze in her car rather than accept that she couldn't control everyone around her. It was a lesson she'd ultimately learned the hard way, and a lesson I'd carry with me forever. Some things are worth standing firm for, even when the pressure to give in feels overwhelming. Especially then.